praying. He went outside to clear his head for just a little bit. And what he saw surprised him. It looked like the entire town of Jericho was out there right along the street of the city, the main street right there. And they were loud and they were making all this noise, and he wanted to know what was going on. He asked a few people, but nobody would talk to my daddy. And he kept on walking around looking for a way to peek through the crowd. You remember me telling you my dad was not a tall man. But then he heard someone say, I can't wait to see Jesus of Nazareth. My daddy had heard about Jesus of Nazareth. He was this man that they said made lame people walk, and made blind people see, made deaf people hear, and he even heard he made dead people come alive again. And my daddy said, I have to see this man. He tried to run past the end of the crowd, but there was no end of the crowd. The crowd just kept on moving and going, and then he saw it. He saw a tree. My daddy could climb trees with the best of them. You know why? Because when he was picked on and he was getting chased by bullies, he'd run to the nearest tree and he'd shimmy right up that tree and be out of the reach. My daddy was a good tree climber. So he sees this sycamore tree, which is a great climbing tree, and he shimmied right up that tree until he was high enough to see over the crowd. And he got a good foothold, and then he turned and looked to try and find Jesus. At first he couldn't see anything. It was just people everywhere. But then he saw the one that had to have been him. It's who all the people were looking at and calling to, and people were trying to reach through and touch this man. But my daddy, it was disappointed. This Jesus, he wasn't an especially tall man. His clothes weren't glowing or anything. He was dirty, dressed commonly. He was no different than any other Jew he had seen. So disappointedly, my daddy started climbing back down the sycamore tree when it happened. Everybody stopped talking. And my daddy looked down, and there was Jesus right next to his tray, looking right at him. And then Jesus spoke up, and he looked up into that tray and said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must eat at your house today. And my daddy thought, how did this man know my name? He did as he was told and climbed down the tree and went up and greeted Jesus. And the two of them walked back to my daddy's house. It was empty. I understand they stayed in there for the longest of times. The crowd wanted to see more of Jesus, had surrounded the house and were waiting for them to come out. And while they were waiting, some of them said, look, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. And they was right. My daddy had sinned against my mama. He had sinned against his friends. He had sinned against me. And he had sinned against God. You see that government job I told you about my daddy had? That was a job of a tax collector. Which doesn't sound too bad till you hear the rest of the story. You see, Romans hired people to collect taxes in different cities, and my daddy was selected to collect taxes in Jericho. And the way it worked was this. Tax collectors were told you had to collect this much money, but anything else you collected was yours to keep. And my dad overcharged a whole lot of people, and he got lots of money for it. And he got lots of enemies for it. I guess part of it was he got back at all those people who, when they were kids, used to make fun of him for being short. And my daddy was tough. He had turned into a bully himself. Well, anyways, they was in there for the longest of times until finally Jesus and my daddy came out of the house, and the crowd began to yell and call out for Jesus, and Jesus quieted the crowd. And then my daddy spoke up. And this is what my daddy said. He said to Jesus, "See, Lord, I now give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody, I will pay them back 4 times the amount." And Jesus smiled at my daddy. And Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to this house." It was talking about my daddy. And then Jesus left. He left Jericho. But from that point on, my daddy's life was like somebody playing a country music record backwards. He got his wife back. He got me back. He got his friends back. He got his life back. You know, my daddy still continued to be a tax collector. He did. But he only collected what he needed to collect. And catch this. If he went to collect taxes from somebody and they didn't have the money to pay it, he'd pay for it out of his own pocket. That's the type of man my daddy came to be. I asked my daddy one day what he and Jesus talked about in the house. And my daddy thought long and hard, and he said, "Morris, some things are meant to stay between people and Jesus. I mean, everybody has to have their own talk with Jesus where they get all the crud out. But I will tell you this, Morris, that Jesus loved me right where I was, but he loved me too much to leave me there." And then he told me more about Jesus. He said just a few months after he came to Jericho, he went into Jerusalem. And on a Sunday, the people welcomed him like a new king. And on Friday, they crucified him to a Roman cross. And he died. And I said, "Daddy, that's not fair." My daddy said, "No,